So, yeah, we're ready to go. Gentlemen, let me welcome you. My name is Victor Kipiani. I'm the chairman for Tbilisi-based Cherokees think tank. Actually, this is our second round of discussions on the war in Ukraine. We had the first round of discussions on the 25th of February. We have the same composition as you see, distinguished speakers and panelists. Let me introduce each of them. Mr. Richard Brady, who is Chief Executive Officer of American Society of Military Controllers, which is also a member of Cherokees Advisory Board. My special thanks, as always, to Mr. Dakota Wood, who is a senior fellow and senior fellow Defense Program Center for International for National Defense, Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Wood, thank you so much indeed. It's always a pleasure to have you. And our next speaker is Mr. Vakhtang Kapanadze, Doctor of Military Sciences, Major General retired, advisor of Cherokee. Thank you, Mr. Kapanadze. Thank you, Vakhtang, for joining us. We are discussing the war in Ukraine, as I said, as we had the first discussions on the 25th of February, so much has happened since our first discussions when we were speaking about invasion, or I would correct myself, re-invasion to Ukraine by the Russian Federation. At this point in time, we have different developments or dimensions in a full swing. The first point that the invasion has turned into a full-blown war, indeed, I should have once again admit that I personally have not expected, the war in the center of Europe of such a magnitude and such scale. The second dimension that we're witnessing unprecedented economic sanctions, which has transformed and provided with a new vigor the Western unity, and this is really something which is very very welcome to in a way. We are also witnessing high-level political talks, which have already started, with some indications of, say, the post-Ukraine European order. I would rather pick up, that this connotation, not just the European order, but post-Ukraine war European order, which also provides us Georgians with some food of thought. What could be, or would be, or should be Georgia's position in the new setup. I would also welcome our speakers to reflect, if possible, on those possible contours of a new setup, of an emerging setup. And the last, but not the least, some legal developments or legal proceedings by International Court of Justice, because actually when we speak about the order, and that order should be based on the rule of law. Definitely, the rule of law provides that investigating alleged crimes and bringing responsible people to the law and to answer the law, and that is also very important. So I split it our discussions into several key directions, although each of you is definitely free to pick up your own angle when assessing the events and providing with your views. I would suggest, gentlemen, that say 10-12 minutes of your views. Then would be preceded by several questions from my side, and basically I think that's how we would end up the second round of our discussion. So If my fellow members from GeoCase do not mind, let us give the floor to Dakota. Mr. Wood, please, your expertise and your insight on the developments. Thank you.
I always prefer following the general, commenting on his insights, but Rich and I guess will follow this up. It's just an extraordinary set of events. We were talking just before going live here that this is a very brutal reminder that hard military power still plays a role in international affairs, and that for those who believe that current and future war would be all digital, zeros and ones and social media dominating the narrative, the stories between countries. This is hard conventional war. It's tanks and artillery and rockets and missiles landing on these civilian population centers. I mean, just the brutality that Russia has brought to Ukraine is a harsh reminder again that all countries need to be aware of this possibility. There was this over the last 20 years or so, this idea that modern nations that were economically interdependent, that they traded with each other, that they had interests in commercial transactions, that such countries would never actually go to war with each other. And yet Russia proves the case that that was just a false notion. So while most of Europe and the United States looked at the buildup of Russian forces around Ukraine and thought, no, this would never happen. They would never actually move from a putative exercise into a full-on invasion. It's, I think, an inherent human desire to avoid this concept of warfare and all the damage that it brings to us. And yet people make decisions like Vladimir Putin did. And we're, now going into the fourth week of this war. So it's incumbent, I think, upon countries to really pay attention to their investments in their own national security. The security relationships between countries really do matter. For example, a long history of the United States working with Georgia. The Georgia has played host to, visiting contingents of Marines and Army personnel and all that to try to better understand the Black Sea region and where we do have these mutual interests with the backdrop of Russia, who seeks under Putin to be much more expansionist, to reclaim what Putin views as lost territories. I think he's probably re-envisioning a Russia of the late 19th century, Tsarist Russia, rather than the Soviet Union, and will probably do anything to accomplish this vision of returning to that grandeur. So we can't discount an increase in brutality in this warfare, this war against Ukraine. Will we see the use of chemical munitions? Who knows? I don't discount it. Putin's mentioning, he's threatening of nuclear capabilities. They have a massive inventory of tactical nuclear weapons. I wouldn't put it past him to try to do something with those either. So now it's to, Georgia and Romania and Poland and Germany and the United States. What would we do in a situation like that? Have we been serious enough about our doctrine, our deterrence theories, our investments and capabilities, the economic resilience of a country? Can it take a shock where we cut ourselves off from an energy provider like Russia has been and still be able to continue, life as we would prefer to enjoy it in our own countries? So it's just an ugly, brutal reminder, I repeat myself, of the reality of war and its consequences. And I think once somebody pulls the trigger, literally and figuratively, it's impossible to know how all this is going to turn out. Will Putin be satisfied with taking half of Ukraine? Will he extend his operations into Moldova? Are the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, free of significant risk? If he's successful in Ukraine, does he return once again to Georgia? So these are very real issues that just cannot be dismissed or ignored or minimized under the pretext of, well, it can all be worked out diplomatically, you know. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Really looking forward to my co-panelists and see what they have to say about this, and certainly enjoy the question and answer, you know, the discussion we'll have following that. So thank you for this opportunity. And
thank you, Dakota. Thank you so much indeed. No, I hear what you say when you mention the sort of, you know, the economy dependence and interaction. That was a fascinating idea which has emerged during the interwar period, which is the period between the First War and the Second War, when there was a belief that more states transacting with each other, less the probability for a war in Europe. Well, since then, you know, unfortunately, that idea has been outdated. And what we're seeing these days, that the war in Ukraine is breaching all the rules and all the stereotypes and putting all things, you know, upside down. And this is really very unique phenomenon, and very, very scaring also, because actually we're dealing with the aggressor who, as if does not admit any red lines, and how far he's ready to go. That's the biggest question mark in this nightmare scenario. I have several questions, but I would probably raise those questions when we're done with the presentations. And let me go to Mr. Bradley Rich. What is your say on the situation, and what is your feeling?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you again to GeoCase for bringing us together again, Dakota and General Kapanadze. I really appreciate everything that GeoCase is doing and has done over the last 3 weeks to raise awareness, to participate in this discussion and bring to light these very important issues, both in Georgia and regionally. It is sobering, as Dakota said, to think that we are entering our 4th week of conflict. I wasn't sure that 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when we last spoke, that we would be in this position, but nonetheless, here we are. And there are very little signs to show that this conflict is going to abate anytime soon, although there are some reports that there are some peace talks going on, some negotiations going on, a 15-point plan that may result in some type of a ceasefire, but I think it's too early to tell whether or not that will really hold. As we talk about this, though, we're talking about the unbelievability of what's taking place. I'm actually reminded of the opening lines of Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, where she describes this grand scene of all of these, kings and royals coming from all over Europe and Russia for the funeral of, I believe it's Edward VII in the early 1900s, and saying how, with these economic ties, political ties, familial ties, it was hard to believe that, they would ever go to war again. And certainly less than a decade later, the war was at Europe. So there is some type of a return to history here that we're seeing. Again, as we look at the past 3 weeks, I think we have to look back a little bit further and suggest that this is a continuation of what took place in 2014, what took place in 2008, 1994, 1991, and even further than that. This goes much further back than just the last 22 days or so. You raise a very good question, Victor. What does the post-Ukraine war look like? And how does, I think we really have to ask, how does it end? And I think there's a couple different scenarios there. Dakota touched on a couple of them. What will Russia be satisfied with? A partitioning of Ukraine, all of Ukraine, turning Ukraine into a Belarus or possibly a Armenia type state. What will they be satisfied with, and what will the West be satisfied with? So I think we can look at this on a couple different dimensions. One, we can never ignore the human impact or the human dimension, what's taking place there. And there is clearly a refugee crisis going on. First and foremost, over 3 million people have been displaced, refugees from Ukraine. There is going to be food instability, which means that this is going to exacerbate for some time into the future as well. There is the economic impact. There's the second and third order impacts of the sanctions. It doesn't just affect Russia, isn't just affecting Ukraine, it's affecting the entire global economy right now. And we're seeing it in oil and gas prices, food prices, commodity prices. prices. So everyone is feeling the economic impact of this. And it's also raising some interesting questions about corporate social responsibility, a whole different area I think we could go into. But what's the responsibility of corporations who are operating in Russia vis-a-vis this war? We have to look at it from the geopolitical perspective, and we've talked some about this, Victor, as well. You know, how countries compete. Will this lead to a move away from multilateralism and possibly more bilateralism or nationalism? I think, again, Dakota raises a good point. Are we going to see more energy independence? Are we going to see more security independence? These are very relevant questions I think we have to ask from a geopolitical perspective. And then again, we can't ignore the regional impacts as well. You know, how does this affect Asia, specifically China? What is India's response to this? And how does this affect other continents from Africa to South America? Those would be interesting discussions as well. And finally, we've talked a little bit about the future of war. What does this portend for the future of war? Clearly, some operational concepts like air superiority, logistics, communication we're seeing are very important, but we're seeing the use of new weapons, novel weapons in new ways, the precision tactical weapons, UAVs, unmanned vehicles, they've got a place to play in this. So a lot that we can unpack here today, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session as well.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you so much indeed. Yeah, but there's some really, pressing issues, and I'm afraid that we have more questions than we have answers and clarifications to those questions. And I was just, I'm realizing that although I have a set of questions before we started this conversation, but during your presentations, I'm sort of, piling new questions on what I already had. I appreciate that we would not have enough time to address all of them. So I would start, cherry picking on my side. But nevertheless, let's come to that point after a good friend of mine, Vakhtang, provides with his insight. Vakhtang, what is clear that Blitzkrieg has failed. This is what we can say for sure. So based on your expertise, what is the possible scenario for the Russians, and what could be the possible scenario actually in terms of military aspects of this war, not political, but and again, with appreciation that you're doing tremendous job, Vakhtang, over the last 3 weeks, providing Georgian audience with your insight, with your extremely competent expertise. So please share some of those with us today and at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this meeting. So all of us are witnesses of 3 weeks of struggle, 3 weeks of heroism, 3 weeks of tragedy, and 3 weeks of brutality. So let me starting with a very brief glance about operational situation around Ukraine and the last disposition of forces inside of this campaign. So right now, currently, almost 8 of 10 Russian armies are already deployed for Ukrainian operation. So we see limited or no progress by Russian ground forces and Navy in achieving their objectives. So let me start explain situation from north to south and the left to right. So first of all, it's direction to Kiev. Approximately 15 to 20 kilometers to Kiev, northwest from Kiev, our Russian forces are still organized position, strengthening their position on this line. From northeast side, their distance from Kiev is approximately 20-30 kilometers. Ukrainians hold the Bravary, a very important direction, a very important city and area. About Chernigov, also very important direction and a very important city, in especially to the access to the access of Kiev. Chernigov remain isolated, but Ukrainians are fighting to keep a line of communication. Next is Kharkov, also very important. So. Yes, Kharkov, very important. The biggest, second biggest city of Ukraine, and the political very important city, especially from Russians. Kharkov continue fighting, and Kharkov Russians are still on the outskirts of this city, and they are trying to avoid this city and continue the direction and continue offense to the southeast direction, and with objective to surround the most of the combat ready units of Ukrainians near Lugansk and Donetsk area. Southwest, Mykolaiv, we have observed no apparent movement toward or past Mykolaiv. Actually, actually Ukraine is starting organized counter strikes with Russian troops, and even near Kerch. The Russians received a very heavy strike and fire from Ukrainian side. So Russian forces have remained largely tied to Ukrainian road network, and have demonstrated an inability to conduct off-road maneuver. The destruction of bridges and roads has also played a key role in stalling Russia's advance. This very important is that Ukrainians smartly organize their defense. They are using operational area defense with nodes, junctions of resistance, with big built-up areas inside of center. They are mutually supporting from each other, forward and depth. Between these nodes are moving mobile groups of special operation forces of Ukrainians and territorial forces. They have tasked to attack combat support and combat service support units of Russian units, of course, and cutting lines of operation. Nowadays, from almost 995 battalion tactical groups, as the Russians call these task forces, we can take account mostly as a first line combat unit, 110 battalion tactical groups. From then, 65 tied in heavy combat already. 13 of these battalions are completely annihilated. 18 still partially enable, I can say, and 16 still in reserve. So of these battalions. So very important also about numbers of casualties which received the Russians. I will try to be more objective and don't use only Ukrainian numbers. I more trust British or American numbers about casualties, and even from them, Russia lost as a KIA, killed in action, 7,006 or 7,000 personnel. If we multiply them as usual 3 times as a with wounded personnel, it will be generally speaking, it will be approximately 15 or 13 or 15,000. It's a huge number. I'd like to remind you that in first Chechen war, which was 2 years, and the Russian lost approximately 5.5 thousand militaries. During 3 weeks, they lost bigger numbers than in 2-year war in Chechnya. In Chechnya, very, very brutal and very heavy fighting. Even after Second World War, they lost approximately 7,000 persons. And if we totally saying, Russia lost almost same personnel as they lost in 2 Chechen wars. I also like to remind you that it's let me give my vision and what is the reason how much a big loss and unsuccessful operation from Russian side. First of all, this is failing of intelligence. And intelligence, not as a military intelligence or FSB or just it's separately taking some different, foreign intelligence, etc. No, all intelligence society, failing of all intelligence society. You know that very good that it's a political leader does not rely on only one sources. But we have today we have 2 options. Just considering situation with intelligence, Russian intelligence. So first is that it's either Putin was told only what he wanted to hear, or Putin did not take account what he was told. This is really, they cannot understand and they cannot detect its people's will for support, for resistance. It's a level of readiness, combat readiness of Ukrainian armed forces, etc., etc. Secondly, this is domino principles. It's second, it will be planning problems and planning failing of Russians. They cannot plan rightly just movement, main directions, axes, etc. How they plan occupied Kiev, 3 million city with, for example, 45 battalion, tactical battalion units. It's again for history. Even in the Second World War, Wehrmacht, German armed forces needed 1,200,000 personnel for occupying and taking Kiev. 1 million. It was Wehrmacht. It was German. Was the best unit at that time, right? And it's this city with 840 square kilometers. How it will be even understanding how it will be taking with just so even for 45 battalions or even 60 battalions, it's impossible. For that actually need, from my understanding, at least army or army group only for this operation. According to Soviet military operational art, for one city, actually it's one city with 100,000 population needed at least one division. I'd like to remember that in 2004 and in Iraqi Fallujah, second Fallujah fight, one of the very heavy fighting with coalition forces against these Mojahids. 13,000, more than 13,000 coalition forces, almost 1 month, 1.5 months, one month, more than 1 month, fought against 4,000 Mojahids. And Fallujah's size is 250, maybe 200 or 250,000 population. So again, this was failing of planning. Another also, just it's very brief, I will try to just say very shortly. Russia shows that they are not ready for modern war. They cannot conduct modern warfare with precision strikes, with dominated manner and informational operation. They show that they have no ability fighting at night. They show that they have an inability. They have ability to conduct. Have not ability to conduct air mobile operation. You can imagine six air mobile operation actually was completely destroyed and completely failed. And also, Russia also showed inability to conduct infantry-centric operations. Russian soldiers tie too much with armor. They cannot move and maneuver without this close support of this armor. It was shown also by Russians, right? And of course, special operation problem with special operation forces. They use, as in Georgia, it happened in Georgia, they use special operation forces, mobile forces, as not paratroopers, it's a maybe elite units as just infantry units, because they have not trained and appropriate infantry unit for their operations. As even Russians call it, their hammering by microscope nail, just using just this kind of units. So this is very shortly what I wanted to say. So thank you, Victor.
Thank you, Vakhtang. Thank you. Thank you for providing us very precise qualifications. And frankly speaking, listening to you, I have a dream, you know, for politicians to speak as precisely as you spoke, you know. So, but well, probably that's the nature of the political life. So thank you so much indeed. And again, I'm just applauding, you know, on a personal note, you know, to all the great job you're doing for the Georgian audience, for educating the Georgian audience. So, gentlemen, let me raise a few questions, if you don't mind, please. And let me start with Dakota. Dakota, you're a defense expert. And one question, if you could please, if you're able to clarify what Zelensky meant while addressing the U.S. Congress when he mentioned the U/24 sort of, you know, new defense structure, defense instrument. Honestly, I did not come across much information on his speech. Are there any insight on your side? What does that mean? You know, and the related question is, I mean, one question, what is all about, and the second question, which relates to U/24, is it an extra indication that, which probably we've discussed when we spoke first time, that good with NATO, fine, we have nothing against NATO, but we're still moving steadily toward the regional alliances, and I would say alliances which are more mobile and more based on necessities, rather than on political, sometimes I would say obsolete agenda. So should Zelensky's reference to U/24 be interpreted in that way? Actually, this is very important, since as we introduce, you know, the concept of the post-Ukrainian European order, it's very important to know what would be the fate of those regional alliances. And yeah, as I've said, if you have any more information, what that means.
Yeah, I think it reflects this awareness, which has been evolving over many years in different areas, that there is a speed to modern warfare. You know, decades or a century or two ago, war would unfold very kind of methodically and slowly. You know, you could only take horse cavalry so far, or foot-mounted, you know, I mean, infantry, you know, marching across landscapes. It just took a long time for things to unfold. And then there was this kind of drudgery, you know, of how the battle progressed. World War I is a great example of that. But today, with, you know, modern motorized and mechanized forces, air power, the use of unmanned systems, the huge appearance of rockets and missiles that could be fired from hundreds of miles away, this sense of speed of action to respond to an unfolding event. So within NATO, this has been recognized, and NATO put together a kind of a rapid response force if a crisis were to break out. And then that wasn't good enough, and so they developed a very high readiness, very high ready joint task force. And the idea is that something would happen. Maybe Russia would cross into Lithuania, for example, or penetrate into Romania, and you would need to surge forces very rapidly. And that presumes that you have to have these forces ready. You know, that there is the decision-making apparatus that can respond so quickly, and that it can't take a week or 2 weeks or a month to assemble whatever that response capability would be, right? So now President Zelensky comes in and says, look what's just happened to us. We're in dire need of humanitarian assistance, logistical resupply, military hardware and munitions. And so if this is the nature of the world we work in, and you can have an actor like Russia or Vladimir Putin in particular, who can be kind of unpredictable, right? He's not really playing by the rules, diplomatically, et cetera. Then this idea of having something, a mechanism that can respond within 24 hours and provide these kinds of support. It could be a natural disaster, where you need humanitarian assistance, disaster relief sorts of things. So he's reflecting and echoing and restating this sense that the world moves at a very rapid pace. And so our structures for policymaking, decision-making, and decision execution need to keep pace with that changing world, right? And as far as the rest of it, this sense of a reordering, right? Where is the U.S. response to this? This continued westward tilt of Ukraine toward Western Europe. It sees what the past was in the Soviet Union, and where Russia has been in the past, as the center of that, where a Russian-dominated future would lead to. Ukraine is a vassal state or wholly owned and controlled by Russia, and he and the Ukrainian people want no part of that. They want to be part of a modern, democratic, representative government, free market world, as captured by the European Union, for example, right, or the security structures of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO. So this is the future that he wants, and Ukraine very much wants to be a part of that. Now, does that mean that once an alliance is made and it's in place for 70 years or longer, like NATO, then it's very hard to change? Well, maybe this rapid change in the world, how things unfold so quickly, maybe we need to rethink that as well. So as conditions ebb and flow and change and evolve, then these relationships, trade or security, need to have that sort of viability, resiliency, changeability. And I don't know that people actually will be able to do that. Governments usually operate fairly slowly. Relationships take a while to develop and evolve, and you don't break apart as easily, as you would also want to be able to come together. So that last part, I don't know that we would be able to get there, but clearly it shows his understanding of the speed at which events can unfold and the flexibility that governments and peoples and organizations need to have to be more effective in responding to those.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, that is my understanding as well. And actually, what we also have witnessed the tripartite setup, which is emerging, which will still have to be seen. What that would be, teaming up by UK, Poland, and Ukraine. That could be probably a foundation for a future alliance which could expand in one way or another. And I also completely agree with you that we obviously have to look forward for new solutions, and the war in Ukraine provides for some compels us, makes us bound to think more proactively. It is no question that there is no way back to the old the security system, because that security system, frankly, does not exist anymore. And same NATO, which is arguably enough, is the part of that old system. Unless NATO transforms itself, it could also be sort of, remain as a legacy of ineffective mechanism and effective setup. So yeah, this is.
Yeah, Victor, I would just add in. I mean, what you're saying there, what we have seen is Vladimir Putin has moved first, and then everybody else has responded to that, right? And I think the president is really talking about getting ahead of that. Being, like you said, more proactive. Setting the conditions to forestall or refuse somebody like Vladimir Putin opportunity, to do something as horrific as he's done.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, thank you for this information. And yeah, absolutely. So, Dakota, I'll get back to you with a final question in the course of our discussions. But meanwhile, Richard, I was just to figure out the question sort of more on a business or finance or economy side, if I may. Well, as I've said when opening these discussions, we see unprecedented scale of sanctions by the West community. But let me, just also to mention before I phrase my question that from what I've read, well, sanctions are not the magic tool. They're not resolving problems, immediately and instantaneously. So it's not sort of in a magic stick, you hold in your hands. And the statistics that the history of sanctions suggests that around from 30 to 40% have accomplished their results. Especially when we speak about completely different animal, which is Russian Federation, so much integrated into world economy, with powerful force, etc. But my question is twofold. Question number one, which don't you think that while unfolding a massive scale of sanctions, it's also a time to provide for some inducements? So the aggressor probably does not sound, very palatable, but just to manage the war, just to manage the conflict and bring it to the resolution, is it a high time, at least, starting thinking about inducement, at least, vis-a-vis Russian businesses or Russian people in the first place, which that have to know, what could be a home exercise, homework, to compel their governments to move in a necessary direction. That's one the question, and the same relates to the sanctions. When someone starts sanctions, he always have to think about unintended consequences, and those unintended consequences, how you yourself is ready to suffer. What we see, there is some spike in energy prices, etc. In terms of public opinion in the United States, of course, I appreciate that we don't have any pollings or any surveys, but your perception, your understanding, it is very critical when we speak about the Ukrainians' resilience. It's also very important to speak about the Western resilience, and it gets down, to the public resilience. How much we all are ready to suffer, and to bear our portion of the pain. So what is your take? Probably this is not a very popular question, but we have to speak about those questions as well.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great question, great discussion to have. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, and that is that sanctions are limited in their effect in a conventional war. That they are as a weapon, they tend to be somewhat imprecise. And there is a lag effect associated with them as well. And we could have a whole discussion about proportionality. If you've got a shooting war going on, is it proportional to impose sanctions? Is that really going to have the effect that you want to have on the ground? So let's unpack this just a little bit. Again, imprecise weapons that sanctions are. You can apply a sanction in this case, but unless you have every everybody going along with you globally, because we do have a global economy now, that's going to limit their effect even more. And while there is a fair amount of solidarity and cohesion with Western nations when it comes to the sanctions, there are enough loopholes out there that are still allowing the Russian economy to continue. Even in Western nations, and when you start looking in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, there are other countries that are willing to still deal with Russia. And this gets back to the corporate question as well. Some corporations, for their own interests, are going to want to continue. Many have pulled out. Many of the large names that have a brand risk associated with them, but there are much smaller ones who are still operating and willing to put their own interests ahead of these global interests. So yes, sanctions are an imprecise weapon. They may affect us and other Western nations, not as much as Russia, but they will without question affect us. And I think we in the United States are all seeing that in increased commodities prices today. I think the greatest fear long term is we enter a period of stagflation, that the effect of these sanctions could depress economic growth in the United States and Western nations. At the same time, inflation is rising, returning us to an era of the 1970s. I think that's something we all have to watch out for very closely. Our Federal Reserve Chair yesterday, Jerome Powell, said that the U.S. economy is still very robust. There's a lot of confidence, a lot of reason to be confident in the U.S. economy right now. So there aren't signs of that, but I think that's something we do have to keep a very close eye on.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you. Vakhtang, a question to you. Well, we say that Russians are not able, and very much hope would not be able to defeat Ukrainians militarily. So as the war goes, but let me rephrase my question. By not defeating Ukrainians by Russians does not necessarily mean that Ukrainians would be able to defeat Russians militarily. So, well, I'm framing my question a bit strange. But would Ukrainians be able to defeat Russians militarily? I mean, if that formulation is viable. Because Ukrainians resisting, the prime objective is to deter Russia. But I would put the question this way: how able Ukrainians are to bring the war to the ends in a military way, or it could turn into impasse, into the situation in flux when Russians are not able to accomplish what they've been thinking for, and Ukrainians are in the same position. Just from your points as a defense military.
Victor, fantastic question and very complicated, by the way. But it's the main line is that its main reality is that for Ukrainians, don't losing means victory.
Okay.
For Russians, vice versa.
Okay.
But today, it's from my understanding, it's the biggest problem for Ukrainians, not weapon systems, not personnel, not some strategy or tactics, the collateral damages, organized. It's like to highlight organized by Russians. I mean, it's talking about morality. When we're talking about war, it's always difficult. But even wars has its own law, but absolutely immoral. Provide doing human casualties as a lever for Zelensky's decision. The biggest problem for Zelensky is this number of casualties among civilians. This is huge pressure for him, and Russia trying to do that, trying to use that. As a Russians defeat, I think that it's the more number of they call cargo 200 or the kill in action. Casualties and it will be not, if not today, tomorrow it will be a big problem from inside of Russia. I'd like to remind just some couple of historical moments. After defeating in First World War, when demoralized and defeated armed forces turned to Russia, happened revolution. After Afghanistan unsuccessful war, after many of casualties, was problem and was explosion from inside from Soviet Union. After disasters in first Chechen war, it was disaster also from Eltsin, etc., etc. So, anyways, this kind of numbers of casualties or numbers of defeats for Russian has matter.
Mhm. I see. I see. Yeah, thank you. I think that the comparisons or the parallels you mentioned, they're very helpful to have a better understanding on the issue. Thank you so much, Bogdan. And the final question, gentlemen, and we'll wrap up. But let me go in this way. I would ask Rich, then Bogdan, please, and then Dakota to sum up. The question is the same to all of you. We again, we regularly say that Putin is a risk gambler, the brinkmanship, etc., etc. Let's focus my question on limits. What could be limits, if any, for Putin to advance in this conflict, in this war, which is, as I'm saying, not just the war in Ukraine, but a bigger confrontation with the West, and that's one point. If we could envisage any limits at all, if we could name those limits, and likewise, I'd also say, what are the limits for the West or for the United States in the first place to pursue when protecting his and the Western alliance interests. I mean, this probably relates, to this to the sub issues of non-fly zone, providing military equipment, expansion of NATO, etc., etc. So, what are those limits on both ends of these two normative worlds? I would say, as I'm saying, it's not just the two normative worlds. They clashing with each other. At this point, hopefully, just within the confines of one country, but that, I mean, theoretically, that could expand. I mean, no one knows. So, could we discuss what those limits are from the both sides? Rich, please, what is your insight? I understand the complex issue, but I think our discussions are to address the complex issues, not just the straightforward questions. Yeah.
Right. No. I think that's a good question, and I think it's an area that's really shifting right now. I'm not sure that Putin's initial desires are what he wants now. I think that the fact that they are willing to come and negotiate to a certain extent indicates that maybe their ultimate outcome or desires are shifting. I think would be the same for the West as well, as we look for a negotiated settlement or a compromise position here. I think initially going in, both sides had a very hardline position. Russia wanting to occupy Ukraine, again, probably turn it into a Belarusian state, something similar to that, where they had almost ultimate control over it. Now they're willing to a certain extent, back out with certain guarantees. One, that Ukraine renounces their desire to join NATO. Two, that Ukraine no longer allow for foreign troops or foreign equipment, which means that effectively Russia would control the security of Ukraine. The question is, will the West accept that? Will they say we were willing to back off in order to stop this, not only this humanitarian crisis, but this economic crisis, and bring this war to an end? I think that's kind of yet to be seen. The broader picture is, what does the rest of the world learn from this lesson? What is China learning from this? And is the West going to acquiesce to regional powers in the future to say, yes, Russia, you've got your sphere of influence. Yes, China, you've got your sphere of influence. India, you can have your sphere of influence. And that is the new world order that we're moving into. But I think as we move to some type of a settlement on the Ukraine conflict, the contours of that are going to materialize.
Thank you so much, Rich. Thank you. Bogdan, your view, how far Russians are ready to pursue the real or mythical objectives, and how staunch would be the West to defend and to pursue their own lines, their own limits? Yeah.
Victor, from my understanding, now Russia using this operational pause for regrouping and collecting additional forces, additional power. From my information, they're starting moving from Siberia some units. For that was some collecting some volunteers, as they call, or contractors from different countries. And from my understanding, maybe after 1 week, last part of this month, Russia will strike again a second times. And in case of, and I hope that it will be without success. Middle of or last part of April will be more clear picture, and it's this time will be more I can say more easy negotiation time and more productive negotiations. Because now Russia are just using this time, playing with Ukrainians and using this operational pause for this own planning, regrouping.
Thank you, Bogdan. Thank you. So, Dakota, same question. Would Russians be bogged down, in Ukraine, just that disabling Russians to pursue, any further in whatever directions, and where the last line of defense by the United States stands?
Once you start crossing kind of thresholds of loss or pain, or a desire for vengeance or whatever that might be, and it always seems to escalate the military actions. At the beginning of World War II, people had kind of an idealized vision of how war would be conducted. And it wasn't very long then until the US and Great Britain, firebombed Dresden. Started hitting civilian population centers. The United States did that against Japan, firebombing Tokyo and other things. I mean, undertaking military actions that were almost inconceivable there at the beginning of the war. So human passions, losses that need to be paid for, right? Some kind of a vengeance strike or a desire to amplify, to increase the amount of violence, with the idea of bringing the war to a more speedy end, right? Instead of letting it drag out. So I think we cannot forget that aspect of warfare. And in this particular case, this is much more a Vladimir Putin war against Ukraine. I mean, there wasn't some pre-existing condition where Ukraine had amassed forces on its borders, and there was this kind of friction-induced condition where both sides, the countries, we're at the precipice of war. This was a President Putin-directed assault on a sovereign nation. So we have to account for the person of Vladimir Putin. What is his pain threshold? What does he view as a win? And I think having bet everything, his political future, perhaps his physical future, if there's an internal coup or Russian oligarchs or the common person just as tired of suffering the economic pain, right, of being cut off from global markets and those sorts of things. Maybe he needs to protect himself from this kind of internal decapping, where he is threatened personally. So I think we cannot dismiss the possibility that he has no limits, and that a win for him, I mean, Rich has mentioned, the negotiations ongoing and those sorts of things, but doesn't that give time for what the general was talking about in regrouping and rearming, reasserting the assault into Ukraine? And so for Vladimir Putin, I think an acceptable win will be turning Ukraine into a vassal state. I mean, he can't walk away without some kind of major accomplishment, taking the agricultural fields of Ukraine, the industrial sectors, the port cities on the Black Sea. He can't just walk away from the negotiating table thinking that kind of a neutral Ukraine is the best he's going to get after what he has done and the costs that have been imposed on Russia and everybody concerned. So I'm very concerned about escalation in the next couple or 3 weeks as people visit more and more violence in order to kind of bring the conflict to a close, right? So your comment about what might the U.S. red line be, instead of providing munition support, the introduction of U.S. military power, or from Germany or Great Britain or France or Poland or anybody else. And I think that that threshold, that tipping point, is when we see additional footage of like the theater where 1,000 people, with children were seeking refuge and it gets hit with rocket fire, or hospitals bombarded, or if Russia uses chemical munitions in some way, the popular opinion will be so enraged that it will force the hand of governments to become more actively involved. So I think that that's a very viable, I'm not saying likely future, but a very viable path that this conflict could actually go down. And this is the real risk, that this inflames into a larger regional war. And I think it really is up to Vladimir Putin as to how brutal he wants to continue getting in the coming days and weeks.
Yes, thank you, Dakota. Yeah, I'm just thinking, that what would happen when Putin faces and really faces historical defeat, and then further, really, it's a quite a frightening question, what could be a reaction from his side and what should be reaction from our side. This is the biggest question, I think, and no one has an answer. And I also agree with you that in these circumstances, keeping the escalation is the most viable option for Putin, because just imagine for a second, if war ends now and here, then what comes next for him? And that is, the most frightening question for Putin's regime. Then what's next? What's next? So I agree. Well, okay. So, gentlemen, so thank you so much indeed. We should close our discussions, and we had a very sad cause together, but at least we enjoyed our communication, and hopefully our audience got some very helpful thoughts. And may I thank you wholeheartedly for all your inputs. I don't dare to say that let's get together in 2-3 weeks, but I will be here if you join me, please feel free. So, but anyway, this is a sort of, already the community with some traditions, so we should carry on if we can. So, it's just, half joke, half joking, half serious from my side, but I would really be very much delighted to conduct, this series. But meanwhile, thank you so much indeed. Peace to you, to your families. This word, got a special meaning, at least in our part of the world, over the last weeks. And may peace with us and with your families. Thank you so much indeed. Have a great day, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, General. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.